So we're now moving on quickly to the second panel discussion of the day, which will focus on transparency. But before I hand over to the chair of that session, I'd just like to remind you that the session is taking place here on Zoom, obviously, but we're also live streaming on the Chatham House website. Great. Well, are you ready? Now over to you.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction to the panel. Firstly, I'd like to thank Chatham House for inviting me to chair the panel on transparency and IUU fishing, to Pew Trust for sponsoring the event, and to the attendees who are with us not only on a Friday at the end of the forum, but also during the immediate global challenge many are facing today. My name is Hugh Thomas, and I'm the General Manager of Offshore Shellfish, a family-run, rope-grown mussel farming company based in the southwest of England. Many of you will now be wondering why I was asked to chair this panel, and the reason for this is that prior to working at Offshore, I managed the market engagement work for Pew's Ending Illegal Fishing project, which aimed to harness market forces to tackle IUU through education and corporate policy implementation. Prior to Pew, I also worked for a UK retailer, Morrison's, as their fisheries and aquaculture manager, tasked with providing Morrison's customers with a responsible and sustainable seafood offering they could eat with a clear conscience. In the last 10 years, transparency has become an increasingly important element in delivering responsible and sustainable seafood and to tackle the undoubted scourge of IUU fishing in all aspects. We've heard the term transparency mentioned in virtually every presentation and panel discussion throughout this forum, and the aim of this session is to explore how achieving transparency in the fishing industry and throughout seafood supply chains is essential to address the opaque environment in which IUU fishing thrives. Moreover, recent research has shown how inadequate scrutiny and lack of transparency onshore contributes to the problem. This session will aim to address the following questions. What progress have the international organisations, national government and the private sector made in improving transparency in recent years? How does the opacity surrounding onshore activities contribute to IUU fishing? And what are the most important measures that can be undertaken at sea and onshore to combat IUU fishing, and what impacts might these measures have? When I first started in seafood, it was often said that because fishing vessels go over the horizon, we don't know what they're doing. Well, today this is no longer the case, as we've heard, and seafood supply chains can be mapped and risk assessed. We will begin with presentations from each speaker, which will be followed by a question and answer session similar to the one previously. If you have any questions for individual panelists or a general comment to make during the panelist presentations, please feel free to use the chat function to make them, and I will address as many as we can with the time that we have. We have a knowledgeable panel today, and it is my pleasure to chair this session. Our first speaker is Steve Trent, Executive Director and founder of the Environmental Justice Foundation. Steve will show us a film which powerfully shows why we need transparency and talk about the changes being seen in improving clarity within supply chains. Steve has worked for over 30 years in environmental advocacy, campaigning for the protection of natural resources, the environment and human rights, taking action to bring about tangible positive change and implementing solutions to ensure genuine long-term sustainability. Steve co-founded the Environmental Justice Foundation in 2000 and currently serves as its executive director, addressing both environmental abuses and the associated human rights violations. EJF engages in detailed field-based investigations and research, combined with advocacy reaching the highest levels of government and business, using film both as a tool to deliver irrefutable evidence and as a means to communicate solutions. Over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hugh, for your introduction, and indeed to Chatham House and the organisers for inviting me to speak today. I know time is short, and actually it's a Friday afternoon, at least in the UK here, so people have had a long week with this. So I'm going to jump straight in and try and keep this quick and focused. There's a few key messages that I really want to hammer home, and I'm not going to apologise for that. So in terms of the summary, the intro for this, IUU fishing and the associated crimes, which Hugh mentioned, about human trafficking, forced bonded, slave labour, and indeed many others, are facilitated. They're allowed to thrive by the opacity of the fishing industry, this opaque environment which currently characterises most fishing operations on our seas and oceans. I think it's in this context that Ian Obina earlier this week mentioned along the lines, if you can't measure it or see it, you can't manage it or control it. And that is something that I feel is a very simple but very important truth. So what do we do? Well, EJF is clear. What is needed is a radical shift towards transparency, bringing these crimes, these abuses out of the shadows, and to allow all stakeholders, governments, businesses, civil society, fisheries management officers, retailers, whoever, to look in and see what is really going on, and then crucially to take action against the rogue operators and reward the good operators. I think bringing transparency can allow there to be winners in this game, and we can facilitate a situation where both sustainability is radically improved and indeed some of the human rights abuses that have been so widely publicised over the past few years are really dealt with. So what do I mean by transparency? Well, I want to say a few things here. Transparency is not an end in itself. It is a tool to achieve our desired goal of sustainable, legal and ethical seafood. And I choose those three words very carefully. It's not just about sustainability. It's not just about legality, and it's not just about the ethics of it. You need to put these three things together. They complement each other. Very often the solutions to one can be a solution to the other. And I personally don't want to be eating seafood product that may be legal and sustainable, but has been produced by a slave. So I think it's important to see these things in a composite way. I also want to stress that transparency is not the same as traceability, but I think it does lend itself to traceability. And lastly, I want to say that it's not a vague concept. I think everybody this week has touched upon it in one way or another in their presentations. And we can see that it's a set of comprehensive tools that are readily available to us now. And critically, they're logistically deliverable. I think they're economically viable now, and they are politically realistic. So that said, at this point, I would like to take these statements out of the conference room, put them back in the real world, and show you the film that Hugh mentioned.
The industrial vessels, there are many in our waters. They are catching the fish that the artisanal fishermen depend on it. And this is our livelihood since we were born, and we have nowhere to go. We have been pleading and talking about it. Nothing has been done. So we need help along the world. If our country couldn't help us, and some people, we are getting out of business and we are dying. That's what I can say.
Pirate fishing is taking place on a vast scale around the world, with as much as 1 in every 3 fish caught illegally. The vessels responsible are plundering what's left of our world's wild fish. Unmonitored and uncontrolled, these vessels often target threatened high-value species, discarding less commercially valuable fish and using highly destructive methods which have devastating impacts on fragile marine ecosystems. As catches from overfished waters dwindle, vessel owners look to save costs and maintain their profits. Labour, one of the few non-fixed costs, is often where operators look to make savings. In the worst cases EJF has seen, this means the use of trafficked slave labour. Crew are kept in line with violence and moved between vessels at sea to minimise the chances of escape. The impact of pirate fishing vessels extends far beyond the oceans. All too often, they are used by criminal gangs to facilitate transnational crime, such as drug smuggling, gun running, and human trafficking. We can prevent these human rights abuses and protect the precious marine ecosystems that so many of the world's poorest people depend on. Simple steps could be taken to ensure greater transparency in global fisheries, and for most of the world's industrial fleets, the mandatory adoption of inexpensive onboard video monitoring systems will not only help support best management and compliance, it will guarantee its working. Other measures should include mandatory vessel monitoring systems, publicly available vessel license lists, the mandatory use of digital logbooks, crew manifests, and catch, landing, and license certificates, all made publicly available. A global record of fishing vessels based on unique vessel identifiers, wherever possible using IMO numbers, and a ban on flags of convenience. These simple, achievable transparency measures would revolutionize global fisheries by better protecting fish stocks, defending victims of crime and human rights abuses, and protecting consumers from inadvertently funding illegal activities. We could create a global standard for transparency and trace the seafood we eat from net to plate.
So I hope you enjoyed that short film, and I hope it brought some of the issues alive. Now, my time's very short now. I don't want to hog the space because there are other speakers that have got far more to say than I have. So I'm not going to walk you through EGF's Charter for Transparency. What I am going to do is just highlight 3 very important points quickly. The first is this issue of publication of vessels by countries. Countries need to do this. They need to publish the vessels in their registry. They need to publish the vessels that are licensed to fish in their EEZs, and they need to publish the licenses for the fish for those vessels that are fishing in distant waters. This one act alone would be transformative. It would allow us to know if a boat is legal, who licensed it, where it's allowed to fish, when it's allowed to fish, and so on. The other point that I think has been powerfully made by others in the previous panel is the need for digital traceability. and for systems like Global Fishing Watch to go to scale. We need countries to support this, to put their vessels on that platform and make the data public. That will allow us to interrogate what is going on in a way now that is not currently possible. And the last point I want to say is that I think, again, it was Tony Long that mentioned this idea of leadership. We need countries to lead. And the manifest example of that would be signing up some of the international treaties that could really do good work in this sector and then implementing them. And among the most important, I would say, are IMO Cape Town Agreement, the FAO's Port State Management Agreement, and ILO C188 Work in Fishing Convention. If countries put those in place, implemented and enforced them, we would be living in a different world. So I think at that point, I've had more than my fair share of time, and hand back to Hugh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for highlighting so clearly how people, communities are affected by IUU, and the lack of transparency allows them to perpetuate, but that when the international instruments and measures are explained within your asks and your closing statements, are ratified and effectively implemented, they will be key to solving the issue and lack of clarity. But as you said, there needs to be a radical shift in approach and increased implementation. The next speaker we have is Austin Brush, Senior Analyst of C4ADS. Austin will explain how ownership and regulations present challenges to transparency, as well as how to clear the fog of opaqueness that still exists. Austin is a Senior Analyst on the Natural Resources Cell at C4ADS, where he primarily manages the cell's IUU fishing projects. Austin is the author of Strings Attached, a C4ADS report on IUU fishing networks. Prior to his work at C4ADS, Austin received degrees in international relations and environmental studies from Tufts University and spent time overseas in the United Kingdom and Tanzania. Over to you, Austin. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Hugh, and thanks for everybody for attending today's session on transparency. I just want to confirm that you can see my slides.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect, thanks. So today I'll be discussing the impact of low transparency on investigations into IUU fishing and some of the tools and data available to circumvent these obstacles, but are also where those challenges persist. So a key obstacle in the fishing sector is transparency, and then the associated challenges of tracing ownership onshore. A lack of transparency enables the individuals and companies benefiting from IUU fishing to avoid accountability and enforcement action at sea and onshore, to obfuscate beneficial ownership, and to launder IUU catch into global seafood supply chains. There are three main areas where C4ADS has identified low transparency as a key enabler of IUU fishing. Firstly, limited surveillance at sea is amplified by weak reporting requirements on shore, limited coordination across jurisdictions, and limited access to data beyond basic company information means tracking vessels and their owners can be quite difficult, in particular across jurisdictions. And this allows high-risk vessels to continue operating with minimal effort required to obfuscate either their identity through vessel name changes or reflagging, or their vessel ownership. Secondly, lacking or limited reporting requirements, as well as limited data availability on shore, means that beneficial ownership networks behind fishing vessels remain opaque. This poses challenges to identifying the individuals and companies culpable in instances of IUU fishing. And it also has ramifications for traceability efforts within seafood supply chains. And then finally, the conditions that enable actors to engage in IUU fishing also allow them to commit other crimes and offenses, ultimately coordinated by these networks on shore that remain largely hidden. The ways in which criminality occurs alongside IUU fishing can be directly linked to the operation of the vessel, perhaps the laundering of IUU catch into illegal supply chains. But there have also been documented cases of criminal actors exploiting, a combination of low penalties, low scrutiny, and low transparency within fishing supply chains to use illegal fishing to subsidize their other criminal activity. So over the course of our research, there have been a number of areas where we've seen opportunities to leverage existing tools and publicly available information to tackle some of the obstacles that arise from this issue of transparency, or this issue of low transparency. This includes at-sea vessel tracking, network analysis on shore, and then supply chain analysis. So advances in vessel tracking over the last few years at sea and increased at-sea surveillance mean it's easier than ever to track and monitor risky vessels, especially when done in conjunction with indicators of risk that can be developed from our understanding of IUU fishing operations. However, gaps in surveillance at sea mean it's also important to focus on the fixed entities onshore, which are a little bit more stagnant and leave a bit more of a paper trail that can be tracked. So a key component of C4ADIS's research methodology is following investigations into these fishing vessels onshore. And we believe it's possible to use network analysis and publicly available data to map out the financial and structural ownership networks behind fishing vessels. This can be a powerful tool to identify who ultimately profits from vessel activity at sea, and also identify links and connections between seemingly disparate fleets across jurisdictions and fishing sectors. And then finally, network analysis and beneficial ownership mapping can serve as the building blocks for enhanced supply chain due diligence. While it's difficult to connect catch from a specific vessel to eventual buyers, by looking at the larger network surrounding a fishing vessel or a fishing company, it's possible to identify commercial relationships between either entire networks or specific companies and the vessels around the world. And importers around the world. So to talk about network analysis a little bit more closely, this is a key component of our work on transparency in using network analysis to map ownership up to beneficial ownership where possible. Using publicly available data, which can include information from vessel registries, such as those maintained by FMOs, using official corporate registries maintained by states, and social media, media reports, NGO reports, all these different types of data. We can use this to identify connections between vessels and their beneficial owners, commercial and trade partners, as well as relationships to other fishing companies and vessels, and even in some cases, state-owned enterprises. But finding, collecting, and structuring this publicly available data at scale can be time-intensive and requires unique access to disparate data sources. This is largely due to the fact that there are still major gaps in immediately available data and varying degrees of reporting standards across jurisdictions that are involved in industrial fishing. A key step going forward to improve transparency, as well as access to information for all stakeholders, would be requiring more stringent reporting standards on behalf of vessel owners. And this would have the potential to improve means by which authorities, enforcement, NGOs, and regulatory bodies can conduct due diligence in an expedited manner. While our primary focus has been on improving transparency surrounding vessel ownership, one of the next steps that we see is layering trade data on top of this beneficial ownership mapping and corporate network mapping. This would have the potential to allow for greater supply chain traceability by illuminating trading relationships between fishing companies, processing facilities, and other companies within their larger network to importers around the world. There's still limits to publicly available trade data, as its quality and detail can vary across jurisdictions. By looking at the trade data of a larger network, as opposed to single companies or even looking for single vessels, can reveal commercial relationships that were otherwise unseen. But it's also important to note here that traceability cannot be achieved solely through mapping out corporate ownership networks or trade data. That's partially due to the fact that information reported in this data is not always accurate nor representative of the full scope of activity. But this type of analysis and this type of information, when coupled with other efforts to increase surveillance at sea as well as at port, in addition to digitizing this information on vessel data and trade data, all these in conjunction can be a pretty critical step towards illuminating commercial relationships and improving traceability within supply chains. So with all that being said, while there are tools and publicly available data that exist that we can leverage and use to map out some of these investigations, as I was saying before, it can be quite intensive, and sometimes there are still gaps and issues contributed to by the fact that low transparency exists throughout the fishing sector. So we've identified a number of key steps that we believe are necessary to improve access to information for all stakeholders and make sure this process of due diligence is more expedited and ubiquitous. Many of these overlap with what Steve was talking about in his last presentation. So firstly, access to ultimate beneficial ownership information would help regulatory enforcement agencies or efforts detect, track, and disrupt investment in illegal fishing vessels within the fishing sector. A critical step forward would be requiring vessel owners to report ultimate beneficial ownership when registering with a flag state or requesting authorization to fish. Additionally, standardizing and publicizing lists of authorized vessels would improve visibility on global fishing operations. And this includes enhancing those at the RFMO level that currently exist, and then pushing for more publicized national jurisdictional vessel registries. The development of the global record of fishing vessels by the FAO is a significant step in the right direction. And then these types of lists would be even further strengthened by the development of a universal unique vessel identifier that would be, therefore, as a result, would be easier to trace vessels across jurisdictions and across registries. Thirdly, another important step would be to push for more transparent and publicized reporting by jurisdictions and by regional bodies. To increase accountability for vessel owners and vessels, countries should publicize any legal or administrative actions taken against these vessels that can be then used for more enhanced corporate due diligence or more enhanced due diligence on behalf of regulators as vessels move between jurisdictions. And then finally, taking a slight step away from transparency, but still critical, would be updating and modernizing fisheries laws and fisheries statutes to more clearly define IUU fishing infractions, increase penalties where appropriate for certain infractions, and then link to the idea of ultimate beneficial ownership, holding those who are ultimately profit from this vessel activity responsible rather than targeting only the individuals on the vessel. So to conclude, an opaque global fishing industry enables IUU operators to function with limited risk of detection. But by improving transparency and focusing on the onshore networks, as well as facilitators behind IUU fishing vessels, it's possible for enforcement to more effectively identify those who ultimately profit from IUU fishing and improve traceability within legal fishing supply chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Austin, for explaining the tools that you're using and steps that can be taken to increase transparency in seafood supply chains. We're seeing that the international framework is certainly important, and that technology is out there to enable the intent of increased transparency for supply chain owners to take the actions they need. I'm sure that we will come back during the Q&A to talk a bit more about beneficial ownership and some of the points that you highlighted going forward. In light of the question and answer session, I would encourage anybody that has any questions for the panelists who are knowledgeable, please send them through to us so that we can log them and get them ready. So thank you very much, Austin, for your remarks and presentation. Our next panelist is Teresa Ish, Programme Officer at the Waltham Family Foundation. Teresa will aim to clarify what is meant by transparency and the ambition it can deliver, as there's often confusion, as well as presenting some of the things that can be done and the landscape in which they sit. At the Waltham Family Foundation, Teresa manages grants in the environment programme that leverages the power of the supply chain to advocate for more sustainable fisheries and advance the sustainability of US fisheries. Before joining the foundation, Teresa was the seafood project manager for the corporate partnerships programme at Environmental Defence Fund, where she worked with leading seafood buyers to develop and implement sustainable seafood purchasing policies. During her tenure at EDF, she played an instrumental role in merging the organisation's seafood buyer and its extensive work in the fishery policies arena. Prior to joining EDF, she co-founded Fishwise and served as its Director of Science. Thank you very much, Teresa. Over to you.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks also to Steve and Austin. I'm going to share my screen quickly. And
Excellent. Yes, it's coming through. So thank you. And I'll just make a reminder to everyone, please put in your questions, and I'm sure we'll get some answers from the panelists. Difficult ones as well. Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I'd like to start with a quote from a former U.S. Supreme Court justice, because I like this because he was both a privacy advocate as well as an anti-corruption advocate, which I think is important to remember, that transparency and privacy are not mutually exclusive. This quote reinforces that we are working in an industry that operates in the shadows, and a little bit of daylight is an obvious way to bring this bad behavior out of the shadows and into the light, and to level the playing field for all of those in the industry. And there are many who follow the rules and fish sustainably. Our community has made huge improvements over the last few years in building out suites of tools that increase transparency, and we saw many of those demonstrated in today's earlier session. And we have a fairly clear picture of what we think we need transparency to provide and it can help with. But the path from making that information available is convoluted. And what we want to see, we also have different goals associated with what we want transparency to provide. And taking it from this information that we think we need to what we want transparency to provide is a complicated path. There's some magic in that squiggly line between the information and the outcomes. And I don't think that's a bad thing right now, that the line isn't clearly defined or that it means something different to different people. There's still a lot
Teresa,
to do, and yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you're showing your notes. You're not showing the full presentation.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thank you for flagging that.
No,
what a
fine.
boring presentation for you. Let me see if I can update that.
So if you do your presentation now and then share your screen, you can then share the actual presentation instead of your notes.
Thank you. Presentation. And then I have to be able to find the share screen. I apologize, everyone.
No, that's fine.
You'd think by now we'd all be quite good at doing this. So is that I wonder, Anna, would you be able to manage that for me? Take that over, just so I don't delay us any longer. Great. Thank you. I apologize. So I am on the third slide now too. Fabulous. Thank you so much. So as I was, back one more. Unfortunately for everyone, there's only 5, so that shouldn't be too big of a problem. Thank you. So I just want to point out that it's not a bad thing that we're still defining what's in between what we want to know and what we want to achieve. I think despite many of us feeling like we've been doing this for a very long time, this work is still young and the tasks ahead of us are still quite immense. And I think what's exciting is that we are to the point where the calls for transparency are increasing. The technologies needed to generate and manage that data are becoming scalable. And that means that the excuses to operate in the shadows are really losing their relevance. And so there's a need to start bringing the community now together and asking ourselves, what do we want transparency to achieve? What do we need to know in order to achieve this? Who needs to share it? Who needs to take action? And what actions do we need them to take? And I think we're starting to define these at different points, but we haven't yet really defined these as a broader community. And without this, there's a risk that we create significant reporting burdens across the supply chain without securing the outcomes that we desperately need. Next slide, please. So as we look at these different tools and approaches, it's clear that not all transparency is the same. Already we've heard about transparency on the water and transparency of the ownership of the vessels and the product as it moves into the supply chain. And it's clear that different parts of the systems have different needs and different tools that are applicable. At the Foundation, we've tried to start breaking down transparency into 3 different groups based on where we think information is being generated. And it's here that I think we can really focus on what we need to collect and who might need to receive it, with the hopes that over time we start to seek some convergence in that information. At the point of production, which I think is where most of our efforts have focused, because that is where IUU happens, we need to know who is fishing, how much they're fishing, how they're fishing, where they're fishing, what they're fishing, when they're fishing. Steve laid out a great set of recommendations from EJF for some of the basic requirements that are needed at production. And this information is clearly critical to collecting the data we need to identify illegal catches, flag human rights abuses, and collect data that help improve management. But what structures are in place to collect and verify these data, and who's responsible for taking action, is still someplace where we need to get clearer and start really setting expectations with the government, which again, some of these organizations are doing. And while transparency of production is necessary, it doesn't really mean a lot until someone is compelled to act and a competent authority can do something with that information. Once we know about the fish and who caught it, the supply chain is next and important in maintaining that information, because once the data and the product are separated, it doesn't do a lot of good as the fish moves through the supply chain. Steve pointed out that there's often a lot of confusion between traceability and transparency. And while I do think that traceability sits in this bucket of transparency supply, it's really important to remember that traceability is just the vessel to move all of that transparency data through the supply chain. And also the rest of this system is dependent on that data moving through the system in a clear and concise way. The last piece of the transparency triangle is at the end, where at the end of the supply chain for both the fish and the information, whether it's the government's responsible for collecting the important data, or retailers with sustainability commitments. These are the users of the data at production. They should be using this information produced at the point of production to make buying decisions, decide which shipments to reject, where to investigate criminal behavior. But they also have transparency obligations themselves that we should be holding them accountable to, whether it's a retailer reporting against their commitments to combat IUU, or disclosing where government officials tasked with regulating fisheries may have financial conflicts of interest. It's important to make sure that the transparency of their actions and their efficacy in enforcing these rules is made public. I think a lot of us want to, when we talk about the end user of this, we often think about the consumer, and I've tried to push hard against this. As a consumer, and I'm probably pretty annoying at a fish counter as well, I want to know that the place where I'm shopping is sourcing sustainable and responsible seafood. I want to know if they operate responsibly overall. But do I need to know all of that information and all of that information that's generated at the point of production? I don't. I'm trying to keep my 7-year-old from loading my shopping cart full of cookies and trying to manage a budget and all of these other things. I just want the assurances that someone has kept eyes on the system the whole time. So I think recognizing the difference in expectations and the needs at different points in the supply chain and the system is going to be really important in making sure accurate information flows and that information is actually used to achieve the outcomes we're seeking. Last slide, please. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the challenges that transparency poses for small-scale fisheries. The Walton Family Foundation has spent the last 5 years trying to ensure that fisheries are managed sustainably in Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Indonesia. And we know that there's limited capacity, both of the government and of the fishermen and fishing communities themselves in some of these places. And often that second U, the unregulated fisheries, are forgotten in this conversation. And yet these small-scale fisheries that are illegal are critically important to global seafood trade, as well as livelihoods and food security. As a globally traded product, seafoods from small-scale fisheries ends up in our markets alongside industrial fisheries. And it's also no surprise that these fisheries are disproportionately harmed by inequities in the supply chain, IUU fishing, poor stock status, harmful labor practices, etc. And so ignoring them because they're small is not an option. And so we have to strike this balance between figuring out how to improve fisheries and not to let any of the bad practices happen regardless of the size of fisheries, but also really considering equity when we write policies and rules on how we expect small-scale fisheries to comply. As a funder, I really benefit from having the convening power to help this community come together. And I'm really excited that we're at this point in time where we can have these conversations about how we put together all those different pieces of the puzzle and untangle that, that line from what information we want and what outcomes we want to achieve. And I really want to close my talk with expressing my deep gratitude for my fellow speakers, as well as for many of you on this call, for the years and even decades of work you've put into bringing the issues around IUU fishing and human rights to light. And we wouldn't be able to have this conversation about the different needs and alignment today if it weren't for all of the work that you've put in. So thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for showing us the breadth of the if we only that you've outlined to us. It is needed for seafood buyers and suppliers to be able to take the opportunity to be transparent. And also, I think it was good for you to clarify what you're aiming to achieve at different parts of the supply chain when you talk to us about the triangle of transparency. And I also have to say, I think we would all welcome the fact that you will not let us forget the challenge of small-scale fisheries as well, which is critical for global communities. So thank you very much, Teresa. Our final speaker and presenter is Jackie Dixon, who is Technical Advisor to the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition. Jackie will present on the challenges and opportunities available to market actors to be more transparent, as well as explaining the methods through which increased transparency can be delivered and explained to the wider public. Jackie has 18 years of experience in the corporate sustainability and sustainability field, including 12 years with the private sector in Asia and South Africa. She was a sustainability director for one of the largest global seafood companies listed in Hong Kong and Singapore, with operations across the entire seafood value chain, including harvesting, sourcing and trading of both farmed and wild-caught seafood. She spearheaded the first industry-led sustainable seafood symposium in Hong Kong in 2015 and chaired the second symposium held in May 2017, which gave rise to the industry recommending the need for a voluntary code of conduct. 1 year later, the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition was born, and she's been on the steering committee and has been technical advisor to the HKSSC since its establishment in January 2018. Thank you, Jackie. I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Hugh. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to get my slides up. Great, and make sure it's all up and running. There we go. Assuming it's all fine, Hugh.
Thank you, Jackie, yes.
Brilliant. So thanks so much for having me on this panel. It's an absolute pleasure to be presenting at such a prestigious forum at Chatham House, and listening in on the technology panel that we've just heard from now. It's phenomenal, the information flow that is coming through this forum. So I do appreciate being a part of this and having such access to information, which is certainly going to form an important part of next steps for the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition, because everything we're learning at this forum obviously can be taken into our respective areas. So I suppose I'm representing the private sector, even though I'm not working at a company anymore. I'm working for a coalition as a technical advisor. But I do come from the fishing industry, having lived in Hong Kong for 10 years, and hence why I'm involved with the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition. And I suppose what I really want to do is just to give people a perspective on some of the developments happening in the private sector space and the role the private sector has to play, and how we can use the market and trade in the marketplace as a lever for change. So my first question I've put up here on my slide is, how transparent was the seafood industry 10 years ago? And you can see I've showcased here Sanford Limited, and they have been reporting on sustainability for over 10 years now. This little icon you'll see in the top right, oops, sorry, I've just gone too fast, but my face is looking at me on the slide. The Global Reporting Initiative, the icon in the top right-hand corner, that's an international guideline on sustainability reporting. Anyone who works in the sustainability space across every industry will know about the GRI. It's very, very well known, and it gives companies and stakeholders very clear indicators on what companies need to be reporting on. And you can see here, Sanford has been reporting on production measures, environmental measures, social measures, and below the table, you can't see because it's cut off by the slide, they even reported on total vessel numbers, and this was 10 years ago. Now, Sanford would have had to do their own homework, because to date, the GRI does not have a sector supplement on the fishing industry, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But this is the only company I know of that was reporting so early on in this space. And the reason I show them is because I use their sustainability report as a guide myself when I joined Pacific Andes in their sustainability department. And one of the first projects I did was to write a sustainability report. And the reporting process itself is an excellent way of getting into every single department in a company to understand very quickly how things operate, who makes decisions, where information flows. So I would say reporting and sustainability reporting should be given more credibility going forward in terms of accessing information flow. Also, it provides information on management in terms of CEO level, MDs, heads of departments, and we're getting into integrated reporting now, which is even more sophisticated. So this is a decade later, 10 years on, and look how many more reports we're seeing, which is fantastic. You can go into these reports, you will most likely see similar information, but not always. Some companies are going to be clearer on their supply chain than others. You'll get some reporting by species, source fisheries, or farms, etc. But and others won't necessarily provide you that level of detail. They'll give you policies, etc., and management systems, which is recommended by GRI. But I think this is just a very positive trend in terms of where we've come 10 years later. So as I mentioned earlier, sustainability reporting, it's a very useful tool for a company to show publicly what it's doing on economic, environmental, and social issues and what impacts it has. But as I mentioned, to date, there has not been a sector supplement or a sector standard for the seafood industry, in particular the fishing industry, which is very much needed because we all know how fishing is very specific, and all the criteria and metrics and data and technology analysis, everything we've been hearing at this forum, it's quite specific in a very complicated and complex industry. So the good news is that you'll see on the screen here, it mentions the agriculture and fishing sector standard is going to be coming up soon, next year, in fact. I'm one of the 18 people who are on the advisory committee for that, and we're helping to define the terms and the issues that need to be reported on for the industry. So I think that's very positive. In terms of disclosure, what does good disclosure look like? I have to use Thai Union here as an example because they really are by far one of the most transparent companies you'll get in the fishing space. So you've got here their fishing vessel code of conduct for their suppliers, because Thai Union don't actually fish themselves, but they source obviously a huge amount of fish, and they've gone to the level of developing a code of conduct for their suppliers. And that vessel code of conduct goes into the details on the legality of the fishing. It even talks about transshipment either being banned or it has to be monitored, for example. And then on the left-hand side is their sourcing transparency document, also available on their website, which tells you exactly which species of fish is being imported into Europe, where that fish is coming from, what was the catch gear, and what are the action points that they're taking on to improve that supply chain. Highly transparent, and I wish every company would manage to do that, and that's certainly a direction that I'm hoping the industry is going to be taking. So this is a list, and certainly not an exhaustive list. There will be other sector collaborations happening. I've just included here some of the ones that I'm aware of. The Seafood Task Force, which used to be the Sustainable Shrimp Supply Chain Task Force in Thailand. They're doing excellent work. We've also got the Proactive Vessel Register, which we even reference in our data tools for our members at the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition, helping to monitor tuna vessels, CPACT as well, CBOS. All of these are collaborations involving the private sector, CPACT obviously being in Canada and the US, and CBOS bringing together some of the largest industry players involved in seafood sourcing. And then you have Ocean Disclosure Project, which is run by SFP. Very interesting website where you go on and you can identify retailers that are disclosing exactly where they're sourcing their fish from. Some will be disclosing more than others, but it's a step-by-step approach, and it's an act of being transparent. And I think a lot of people, perhaps in the industry at least, might be a little bit fearful or apprehensive to suddenly, be disclosing all the fish that they're sourcing across the world. I would say, and so would Ocean Disclosure Project, is you've got to start somewhere. Start to disclose, and over time you make improvements and you make enhancements. I personally, like at my time at Pacific Andes, one of the first things I wanted to do was to get all the fish that was sourced from their procurement department into the sustainability report. And if there were any challenges on it, so be it. Let those challenges come, because that can only strengthen a company in terms of their procurement systems. Then you got the Seafood Stewardship Index, which is looking at the 30 top fishing companies in the world. Global Tuna Alliance, also a relatively new initiative looking at focusing on tuna and working very closely with RFMOs. Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. This is the first 1.0 standard that we have now, global traceability standard, defining the key data elements, which is very much needed for us because we all do want to align to the same collection points. And that was just launched recently this year. So very exciting for that going forward. Pew has also trialing an IUU tool developed by the SFP, and that's first on tuna, and we might even look to say do other species trialing that out, say for example leopard coral trout, which is an important species for Hong Kong. And then we got the Sustainable Seafood Coalition in the UK, and we're very thankful to them because the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the UK coalition. They've been around for a number of years already, and they have also industry members, processors, retailers, all working towards a code of conduct on responsible sourcing, and Hong Kong managed to adopt their codes, and we just localized it. So I'm just going to be moving on now to the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition, what we are doing there and what we're about. So the reason why the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition came about is because in 2018, at a Sustainable Seafood Symposium that we organized, or myself helped to organize with ADM Capital Foundation with the help of Swire funding, and with Teng Hoi, an NGO in Hong Kong. We brought industry together, mainly retailers and hotels and buyers of seafood, importers, to discuss what are the key risks and challenges happening in Hong Kong and in terms of seafood supply chain. We had speakers from on illegal fishing, we had speakers on forced labor, human rights issues, and at the end of the day, the attendees they agreed, yes, these are huge issues, but we can't do this alone. And that's when Hugh Thomas, thanks very much to Hugh, was also at the symposium, whispered in our ear and said, look, the UK has a very interesting model, why not try their model? And that's where we proposed the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition to follow what the UK are doing. So what are we about? So we're industry members only, except in our steering committee, we have an NGO, Teng Hoi. We've also got ADM Capital Foundation. We've got Hugh Thomas as well guiding us, and myself. And we're basically aiming to move the industry forward in Hong Kong so that they're sourcing seafood. The vision is to source seafood into Hong Kong that is legal, traceable, and biologically sustainable. So we've got 13 members now as I speak, but we've just had 2 more join, so it's getting bigger. These are a lot of our members are importers of seafood. So they're the SMEs, I suppose, of the seafood space. But increasingly, we're looking to getting hotel companies joining as well. And we're very, very excited to try and help move them on. And it's a step-by-step process. We're not expecting everyone to be able to meet our codes of practice overnight, but at least they're showing the commitment. These are codes of conduct. We've got one on sustainability, and it includes also on legal fishing, so legal fishing, risk screening, so and traceability. So there's 2 major screens. There's one on sustainability, one on legality. And our members, one of the first things they have to do is to read the code and then start implementing measures in their supply chain to try and meet the code. And again, I emphasize this is not an overnight thing. This is going to take years for these members to be able to achieve this. Okay, and I'm just looking at timing. How am I for time? I think I'm
Just about there, Jackie. You're all right. You've got a couple more minutes. Okay.
A couple more minutes. Okay. I do tend to talk quite a bit when I'm presenting. Okay, so I just wanted to also point out that in our when we were developing the codes of conduct, which I mentioned on the previous slide, one of the key adaptations we made from the UK, we obviously recognize IUU is a major risk in the Asia region, and given that companies will be sourcing a lot of fish from Asia. We decided having an illegal fishing screen risk assessment was important, and this required referencing international documents. A couple of documents that Steve's already mentioned: the publicly available specification 1550. That was like my little tomb when it came to identifying what metrics we need to be looking at. And then there's the British Retail Consortium, BRC, and the EJF and WWF advisory note on seafood supply chains, how to avoid IUU. I was using that already prior to my Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition days. Very, very informative document. And again, they've got an interesting decision tree in there, which helps you to just identify and think through the flow of information. So as a company person, or corporate person sitting in the sustainability team or procurement team, what are the key things that you need to start looking at? Some other really interesting reference materials that we're looking at. Trig map tracking is included in our data collection tool for members to help them identify if any of their suppliers might be coming from a blacklisted vessel. There's the EU IUU carding system everyone will know about. We also asked that as one of the questions: has the country been flagged by the EU, either yellow or red? And then the Port State Measures Agreement is also another reference point for us to look at to say, has the country ratified it? Clearly, these are not going to be, what's the word? It's not going to be a final yes because the PSMA has been ratified or because it's not on the EU red or yellow card. It's not going to be saying, oh, that's legal. These are just reference points to enable deeper scrutiny if things come up as problematic. And I'm certainly going to be adding on Spyglass website to the list now after hearing it being presented today. Okay. Final slide. I just wanted to show this one because I personally find it fascinating, being a South African, to see the amount of abalone that is landing up in Hong Kong. So I've got a slide up here that says, the estimated import value of illegally harvested abalone, the H. Madeira, comparing it to other major fish species that are exported elsewhere from South Africa. And of the abalone coming from South Africa, 90% of it lands up in Hong Kong. And of that 90% of abalone, 65% is regarded to be poached. So technically it's illegal. And so only 35% is legally traded. And of that, I think the majority is farmed abalone. So about 2% of it comes from the wild catch. All of this information comes from traffic excellent organization doing really good research on abalone trade. And Hong Kong is a very important trade portal for them, because at Hong Kong, we consume a huge amount of seafood and a lot of highly endangered seafood species as well. So what we'll find is that we've got a lot of trade information on high risk species like abalone, like shark fin or fish maw, for example. We've also got some useful research there, and live reef fish trade. But what we don't have information on the totality of seafood trade coming into Hong Kong. And I think that's where we need to work closer now with the customs office. That information is available. It just needs better analysis and scrutiny, so we can identify exactly what's coming into Hong Kong, by what transport mode, and where it's landing up once it's in the city. So to better identify trade flow in order to enable our members to know where the riskier areas might lie. And that's it from me. I just wanted to finish off with The Outlaw Ocean. It's an excellent book, and I highly recommend everyone to read it. I've been using my lockdown to get up to speed on it, and Ian Abina has done some excellent exploration work out in the ocean. Everyone should be reading it. Okay, that's it. Thanks you.
Thank you, Jackie, and also for highlighting the fact that trade data and information is also, the transparency of it is also critically important to addressing the challenge that we have. It seems to me that there are many collaborations, coalitions, partnerships, as well as reporting mechanisms to assess and avoid IUU risk for buyers and seafood chain owners. And it is critical that they adopt them and use them. And I do wonder whether there are already sufficient tools available to seafood supply chain owners. And I also welcome the fact that Hong Kong is taking some positive steps when there's little domestic pressure for it to do so. So we've had a few questions coming through. I will start off with a question for the panel, all of the panel. So we'll start off with a question on governance and political will. So in many areas where IUU is a major problem, governance is not strong and the destination markets are not driven by concerns about the governance of the seafood. In these situations, what are the leverage points that can increase political will to implement transparency? And I'll ask that question first of all to Steve, please.
Wow, big question. What are the leverage points?
We'll kick off with a big one, Steve.
I mean, there are first, which is a bit corny, is to say, bring the crimes out of the shadows and highlight them. I think that does produce some leverage if it's done carefully. But I would say more importantly is the value of partnership of using market-driven forces. And what I mean by that is trying to engage with market states to ensure that they are applying a conditionality to their consumption of product that forces down, whether it's transparency or other mechanisms through the supply chain, and actually drive some kind of positive change. And you can take that down a scale. You can look at individual corporate entities that have the power and influence to do that, and you can look at some of the producers indeed that can play a role in that. But I think leverage is a big issue. And more than anything else, what I want to say is that in my liaison with governments, pushing home that message that if you manage this well, it will keep on giving. It will give you revenue for central government treasury. It will give you jobs, livelihoods. It will give you food security and export income. And I think perhaps that's the argument that has to be won overall, instead of just looking at it as a short-term piggy bank within the context of a one electoral cycle or something like that.
Okay, Steve, same question to Austin, please.
Yeah, so I think for certain examples of kind of improving transparency initiatives, there needs to be leaders in the space, and that can either be on a jurisdiction or state level, or that can be on a kind of more regional fishery management organization level. So for beneficial ownership, because that would be a relatively new facet or level of transparency within the fishing industry, it's critical that, either a single state or a group of states, kind of iron out the details and push forward on that. in its implementation to show that it's possible and show its effectiveness. I know there's certain, it was discussed a little bit earlier today, but the FFA has already kind of boosted the fact that looking at the persons and individuals behind the fishing vessels and behind the fishing companies is a major initiative and of the utmost importance to them. Movements in that direction and showing that the information is important and that it's also feasible to collect it and use it would be a critical step towards, I think, improving the political will on a global level for implementing some of these new mechanisms for transparency.
Okay, thank you very much. Teresa?
Great, thanks, Hugh. I think that there is a huge challenge when you don't have interest either from markets where the product is entering or the government. And I want to point out that the research that went into the formation of CBOS looked at the top seafood companies and identified the fact that these very few companies had their fingers in almost every seafood producing country. And that really creates an opportunity because they're already selling into both markets that do have demand for transparency and traceability and sustainable products, as well as those who don't. It gives them immense power of influence. And there are really two ways that these supply chain companies can help motivate governments to start to manage and monitor their fisheries. And the first is by almost operating in a quasi-governance system when they, through their supply chains, require the types of data and information that we would want to see to combat IUU. Those companies themselves can collect the data, manage it, and move it forward. That is obviously less than ideal. It certainly puts the burden and cost on the few leaders and allows the laggards to continue to operate. And so it's also really important these companies start to advocate to the governments about why this information is important and to the points that were made earlier, why this adds value to the country in the long term. I think it's really important to remember that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the trade ministries, and the finance ministries are often stronger actors in the government than the fisheries ministries. And even then, the fisheries ministries tend to be production oriented and not necessarily sustainable management oriented. And so having those voices from the industry really make the case for why this provides financial value to the country, as well as securing the sustainability and responsibility and ethics of how they produce their fish, I think makes them a really powerful actor in dealing with this challenge of having governments who are not prioritizing fisheries and generally markets who the demand for sustainability is uneven.
Very good. And I suppose as we're talking about public resources, and of course, companies advocating to governments to do what they should be doing is certainly an acceptable step to take. Jackie, same question for you.
Sure. I agree with what Teresa was saying, how companies can go ahead and collect information and use that also to work with governments on policy change. Completely agree. And that's actually going to be that is very much one of our theories of change at the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition, is that if we can prove that our members can over time start to collect information on vessels, flag states, beneficial ownership, and understand exactly who owns the seafood once it's landed and once it gets to the buying end, then we can show government that this is possible and that there is actually a certain number of companies who are willing to do that. But on the other side, other than us, volunteering to do it, I think what we need to do as well as a coalition is we need to support our members and government better by doing some analysis, and that's import data analysis. I think we need to identify how we can use metrics from customs data to identify hotspots and then work with government on that. So we don't want to go empty-handed with no kind of support research and information. We need to be better prepared before we can help governments to think through what kind of documentations they should be requesting. Just an example, health certificates are not mandatory in Hong Kong. It's still voluntary. It's a recommended document for seafood importers to be requesting, but it's not mandatory. And I see that My screen hasn't frozen. No, you heard that part. Okay, good. Okay. Hugh, you muted yourself.
Sorry, thank you, Jackie. A question for Austin, please. It's a little bit about IMO is in charge of 2 unique identification number schemes managed by IHS. Unique ship identification number exists and is mandatory for some merchant vessels under SOLAS. The scheme has been extended in cooperation with the FAO for their global record to fishing vessels of 12 meters and above, and some RFMOs have made the IMO number mandatory for fishing vessels. Another IMO unique number scheme also exists, covers companies and registered owners, and is also mandatory under SOLAS. The information is made available, in particular on GIS, with the registered owners, beneficial owners, and operators included. The scheme has not been made officially applicable to the fishing sector. And would it be of interest to fisheries management entities, including the FAO, do you think, to officially extend that to second-hand schemes, such as way the IMO number has been, which I think comes to some of the points you're making on beneficial ownership, etc.
Yeah, I think ultimately expansion of IMO to fishing vessels would be a critical step forward. And as the question commented at the beginning, there's already been steps towards kind of increasing the number of vessels that it applies to. I think that ultimately that's kind of the direction that we need to go, is having that traceable number that you can then identify a vessel from its point of construction to then through any subsequent changes to it. I think also there needs to be a push towards, so because IMO regulations and the requirements for IMO can also be based on a national jurisdictional level. So there needs to be a larger push towards countries requiring these kind of unique vessel identifiers, both at the national level and then in conjunction with regional bodies or international bodies.
Okay, thank you very much. A two-part question for Steve, please. How can we deal with the dangers of making data such as AIS publicly available, given that this could be used for tracking vessels by pirates and armed robbers at sea? And also, as transparency increases by seafood buyers, how should they worry and handle the fact that there could be some negative connotations towards them from stakeholders such as shareholders, NGOs, and customers?
First question, honest answer is, that there's limited options out there that you can do this, and you are making a trade-off. But I think there are certain geographies where you could come to agreements about how that data is shared and transmitted. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. So if you want to look off the coast of Somalia, then maybe you wouldn't be sharing that data with everyone if you're fishing there, but you could be sharing it with fisheries management officials, with governments in a discreet way. So as I say, my preference generally is that we make this data public, open to all. But I think in some situations where that might risk life or there are other considerations, then let's just be sensible about it. Let's not try and squeeze that square peg through the round hole. With regard to the second part, which I've now actually forgotten to.
So yes, it was about the fact that as the call for increased transparency comes, there may be supply chain owners who are reticent to share the data, even though it will help to bring the problem to light because of the ramifications that it might bring.
Yeah, this is a big problem, and I am actually very sympathetic to particularly corporate partners who have this issue, because it's very difficult to say we have a little bit of slavery in our supply chain. And the reality is that, it's not the unique domain of a corporate entity to suddenly wave a wand and eradicate all these problems. So we need a collegiate response to this. We need to work together collectively. And that includes the NGOs working with the corporate partners and governments and others. My favorite cliche, you will have heard me say before, Hugh, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And we have to move this towards good. And so we need to have those discussions, those partnerships, those relationships of trust that will allow us to shift this piece forward. because there will be negative connotations from transparency, because in most supply chains, if you dig deep enough, you can still find some of these problems. But I think I personally would respect it if a corporate entity is actually trying to deal with these problems and really dig deep and get rid of them.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. A question for Teresa. It's about beneficial ownership, the banking sector. With the efforts put into banking systems to fight money laundering and preventing the financing of terrorism, including exposing where money is coming from and where it is going to, shouldn't it be possible now to provide information on beneficial owners to fight IUU when this information has been considered confidential? I believe the Walton Family Foundation has been looking at banking and finance as well as part of its work. So can you give some thoughts on that question?
Yeah, and I will also defer to Austin, given that is C4ADS's bread and butter. But we do think that for a number of these publicly seafood companies, of which is a handful, it's clear that having IUU in the supply chain, as well as having unsustainable fisheries and human rights abuses in the supply chain, create substantial risk. So I do think there is an opportunity to highlight that risk and make it material, financially material to the investors. But there's also some really interesting aspects around this. And I'm sorry, my family is starting to wake up and emerge for the morning. But I think also there are other financial tools as well, where understanding who the owner is creates additional financial risk, like for insurance companies. If you're insuring an owner who has a known interest in a number of illegally operating vessels, that would certainly change your calculus on rates and insurance. But I think this is a place where Austin may want to fill in any gaps.
Absolutely. Austin, there's also a supplementary part to that, which is, many in the corporate and in the seafood supply chain world, I think would like to look at beneficial ownership, but it's knowing what they can do and where they can get the information from. Do you have any thoughts on that in the original question as well?
Yeah, thank you, Teresa, for your answer as well. And then I think this question is true in the sense that beneficial ownership is used in other areas and other kind of regulatory efforts. One of the key steps to kind of using that effectively within the seafood industry would begin to address what ultimate beneficial ownership really means in the context of the seafood industry. And that's both for looking at vessel ownership, but also looking at seafood companies as a whole. There's many different variations of what beneficial ownership is and how it's defined. So just having a better clarity on that would eventually be kind of a critical step forward, having that universal definition that is for effectively using it in regulation and enforcement. What was the second part of the question again? Sorry.
It was about, there are a number of seafood buyers who would like to explore the beneficial ownership part. Where can they go? What resources are available? Is it C4ADS who they should be contacting, or are there other things that they could be using now in terms of making those insight into their risk assessments?
So right now there's a limited amount of immediately available information on beneficial ownership. They can still use RFMO vessel registries to find vessel ownership. We're currently actually working on a project ourselves to look at the beneficial ownership behind some key industrial fleets, including longline fishing fleets and reefer fleets, which will eventually be kind of disseminating. Yeah, for the time being, that's the main source that I can think of.
Okay, so there's still more tools that are needed from a supply chain and supply chain owners' point of view.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's not quite enough visibility on that issue as yet.
Perfect. Okay. Question for Jackie. How much attention do the standards and guidance of the Hong Kong Sustainable Seafood Coalition pay to method of production with regards to the role of disrupting fishing practices? Are bottom trawls products, for example, regarded as particularly high risk, irrespective of stock sustainability or IUU profile?
Okay, so we do in our sustainability risk assessment tool or decision tree, we have a low, medium, and high risk category, and that would look at fishing method and the state of the fisheries itself in terms of if it's being caught using the sustainability metrics or not. But in terms of gear, we don't have a ban on certain gears. Of course, illegal fishing methods like poisoning and cyanide, we wouldn't, that's illegal. So technically a member would have to stop sourcing. But in terms of bottom trawling, we don't necessarily specify. It's not, we wouldn't say to a member, you can't source bottom trawled fish, but they have to go through the same screening process as every other product. And if at the end of it, it comes up as high risk, then it's something that they need to start engaging suppliers on. We don't necessarily tell members to stop sourcing, even if it's high risk, but we rather recommend engagement. If after a period of time, engagement is not showing anything positive, then yes, of course, you have, the recommendation is to change.
Yeah. So a question both for Teresa and for Steve. There are still paper-based catch documentation schemes being employed, and some developing economies are slow on adopting electronic-based systems because of cost. How do you see this affecting the future of seafood traceability, which then leads into transparency within supply chains? Firstly for Steve, please.
So I think there's a simple answer to this. It's one of the areas, the person who asks the question raises the issue of developing economies. And I think this is an area where the developed world can help. Simple tech transfer, ship over the catch documentation schemes that they have. And that would have 2 points of value. First, it would be helping those developing countries to adopt a scheme that would, in the long run, is cheaper. Bits of paper are expensive. Expensive, they don't work at all well, as we all know. So digital systems can really help them streamline both the utility of the system and the cost. But the other side of it is, when I look at these systems, I want to see, broadly speaking, interoperable systems. So certainly the work that we're looking at with European Union, US and Japan is trying to bring as much commonality as you can so you can share data and you can make it actionable. By building common systems across the developing world as well, you would be getting that added value also. So I think that's the simple answer. And I think developing countries do need help.
And Teresa, also in the context of the key data elements from the global dialogue on seafood traceability, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Steve. I think in many of these countries, paper is better than what they have now, which is nothing, but it is a very flawed system. And I think the global dialogue on seafood traceability nicely outlines the type of information that needs to flow. I think the ongoing challenge with this is that if those catch documentation, if those catch certificates are not accurate, then it doesn't matter what system they flow through. It is just moving bad information around. And so transferring and supporting those countries to issue electronic catch documentation is really important. And I think just to reinforce Steve's comments about the need to align the catch documentation requirements for major markets, as well as ensuring that it's electronic, is that also really helps prevent the same catch certificate from being used multiple times, and actually using a legal document to launder IUU product. I think that is a real risk if every country does this independently and doesn't do it in a coordinated fashion.
Okay, so just to follow on from that then, back to Austin, please. Digitalization is lauded as the deliverer of the transparent intent on that basis, because it allows the smooth and comprehensive transfer of data. So how do you foresee that supply chains could overcome that, where you've got brokers at port who sit in the middle of the supply chains with two ends that want to do something correctly, who are, as Teresa says, actively laundering or involved in tax avoidance schemes? Are there things that you've seen within your area that could help with that?
Yeah, I mean, in that to that point, the digitization of information doesn't necessarily ensure its accuracy, right? And that will continue to be a challenge. We can see that in publicly available trade data too, where descriptions for products are not representative of what's actually in the shipment. So for like shark fins, it could sometimes be classified as dried fish, and so challenges there are certainly prevalent, and digitization doesn't necessarily clear those inaccuracies. Perhaps I could think of ways to improve accuracy by incentivizing it. I'm not sure if necessarily punishment or increasing repercussions for mislabeling and misreporting is the right way, but I mean, that might be an option.
Okay, thank you very much. And a question for Jackie. I think we're getting to the end of our allotted time. Visibility is older than transparency, and you measured GRI, which was very much about visibility rather than transparency. The first is related with companies' reputation, and the second is more related with best practice, but both impact the company image and brand. Will the human factor be a key aspect in pushing transparency? If this is the case, then transparency and good behaviour start with us. So is the solution regulation or is it education?
So the question is on, what's the exact question?
The human factor, is it regulation or is it education that will drive transparency as well as the reputation of companies?
Okay. I think it needs to be both. I think there's so much voluntary stuff that we can do as an industry, but there's one thing that companies will adhere to, and that's if they've been beaten by the law and they've been exposed. So companies might, try and skirt the law as much as possible, but once it's found, they'll quickly come in line. Unless it's companies like what Ian Abina talks about on the South Korean companies, which it just boggles my mind that those vessels are still operating. But so I think regulation has a very, very important role still to play, hence why our coalition in Hong Kong needs to do both. We can do voluntary data collection with our members, but ultimately we need the Hong Kong government to support us in terms of our import controls. So to be requesting certain documentations that are going to enable our members to ensure, it's traceable and transparent and legal products. So both, 100% both, yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. Apologies to the people, to the attendees who have asked questions that we haven't been able to get the answers to, and I'm sure the panelists will be happy to provide some answers offline if that's possible. I would like to thank the panelists for their time and for their clear and insightful answers. I'd like to thank the attendees for sticking with us on a Friday, and also very much like to thank, on behalf of Chatham House and everybody involved, Anna Alberg. She has been working very tirelessly to pull this all together. I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to do it myself, and she's been cajoling us all to get everything done. So a huge thank you to Anna for her work over the months to bring this all together, especially with the challenges that coronavirus added to it as well. So thank you all very much, and I'll hand back to Anna.
Thank you, for those kind words. It makes me smile. And thank you also to Jackie, Austin, Steve, and Teresa. What another fascinating panel. I think we've all learned a lot. This was actually the last session of this year's IUU Forum. And I would like to say on behalf of Chatham House, once again, a huge thank you to everybody who has participated, both as panelists and as attendees. You've been really amazing. And I'd also like to thank the Pew Charitable Trust, who is funding this conference. And I'll of course be sending out the highlights from these sessions that we've had today later this evening. But I also wanted to flag that we will be posting the recordings from the conference on our website early next week. So you'll be able to go back and to view any sessions that you might have missed, or just re-listen to your favorite parts of the sessions that have taken place this week. And you've of course been posting lots of links to articles and interesting papers in this shared Google document over the course of the week. And we will be doing some editing and some cleaning up, and we will send you this link again next week so that you can retain access to this information. And finally, we're of course really keen to get your feedback on this forum and on the sessions that have taken place today. This is so that we can create an equally good forum next year, or perhaps an even better one. So I'd really encourage you to fill out the survey that Ruth, my colleague, has posted a link to in the chat function. All right, that was all from us. Thank you again so much for joining. I think it's been a great week. I've worked very much, but I've also had a lot of fun and I've learned a lot. So have a nice weekend.